My name is Mike Bruton. I'm a member of the Council of the Royal Society of South Africa, and it's my pleasure to chair this meeting this evening in the absence of our president, Stephanie Burton. The Royal Society of South Africa is the country's premier network of scientists, and this meeting is co-hosted with the Academy of Science of South Africa. I'd like to ask all of you to please mute your microphones until after the 45-minute talk, when you'll be invited to ask questions, either directly or through the chat box. I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of the Royal Society, and also as a small matter of business, welcome some new members to the Society, which is open to anybody with an interest in science. Our new members this month are Professor Rasilo Mocheki from the University of the Witwatersrand, and then several postgraduate students from UCT who have recently joined as members. They include Chandri Tabeli, Armin Rezai, Nadira Mula, Stephanus Dutoy, and Robin Craythorne. This evening, we're very privileged to have as our speaker, Dr. Morné du Plessis, who has been the Chief Executive Officer of WWF South Africa since 2007 and serves on several WWF global and continental network committees. Morné has degrees in agriculture and zoology from Stellenbosch and Pretoria universities, an executive MBA from the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town, and a PhD in zoology from the University of Cape Town. He sits on many committees and inter alia chairs the Academic Advisory Board of the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Studies. Morné has presented keynote lectures and scientific presentations at a wide variety of local and international conferences and authored or co-authored over 50 scientific publications in the field of conservation biology and behavioral ecology. He was previously the director of the world-famous Percy Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town. And before that, he held positions with Natal Parks Board and was associate director, and was a postdoctoral research associate at the University of California in Berkeley. Morné, it's my great pleasure to see you again and welcome you and invite you to deliver your talk, which is entitled A New Deal for People and Nature. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate that introduction, and I also appreciate the attendance of so many of you. I've had a quick scan through the participant list, a lot of old friends, and somewhat intimidating because you know, I've been out of academia for 15 years, and I see some real heavyweights. But anyway, what I will attempt to do today is perhaps to bring together the practice of conservation and what we do and how heavily it depends on the original work of many of yourselves, some who I could see clearly on this on the participant list. So let me just get going on the sharing here. So as Mike said, I have been with WWF for just on 14 years, and not to complicate things too much, I want to make sure that everybody have a good feel for what I'm about to say. I'm trying to get my, structure of the presentation up to orientate you. The New Deal for People and Nature is in the title, and I had to perhaps give just a little bit of background on how our future for people and nature looks And in the process, I'm going to be tying together some of the global agreements, as well as some of the treaties that are currently under review. But I'm going to spend some time on explaining the magnitude of this challenge, and to ask the question, why should we care about nature? Now, of course, it's a rhetorical question, before I end up trying to pull these things together again from where we started. So if we just remember that when we look at nature, human beings are a fundamental part of what is on this, what is also being called the blue planet. And the Sustainable Development Goals have been put together and have been embraced by most countries across the world as setting the agenda for development in a sustainable way, making sure that humans live healthy and dignified lives, while at the same time ensuring that that subsequent generations are also able to do so. So I'll drill into the SDGs a little bit deeper without hopefully making it too much of a focus. Then, of course, there's the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there in 2015, we had the Paris COP, where certain commitments were made by various countries. And then there's the Convention on Biodiversity, on biological diversity. And this is coming up for review towards the end of this year. It's already a year late. It's been postponed because of COVID. But you will see through the presentation that I try and pull these three together, and I try and make the case for nature as underpinning everything else that rests on top of that. So let's get on with talking about the magnitude of the challenge that we face. And basically, many of perhaps the more senior people on this seminar will immediately think about the problems that arise as a result of having so many human bodies on this planet. Now, you can see here that in the 1800s, we were around about 1 billion people across the world, and that grew somewhat exponentially. And we're sitting at about 7.5 billion, peaking. The projections are that we're likely to peak around about 9 to 9.5 billion people on the planet, whereafter it'll plateau and slowly decline after 2100. Now, what this graph really tells us, other than some of us saying, well, this is the root cause of our challenge, but what it does present us and what it presents nations across the world is to answer the question, how are we going to prepare this planet to feed, to clothe, and to give water to people, to provide for the energy needs of that many people. And of course, that is a question that needs answering. But if we then also put on top of purely the number of people that exist on the planet and that are yet to be born, we look at the issue of how we consume, how we make use of resources generally. And you will see from all of these graphs, I'm going to single out 2 or 3, maybe 4 of them, but it's purely to demonstrate the great acceleration. We've gone through the last 50 years or so has really just raced ahead. exponentially in many respects. And so, for example, we look at energy use, just shot up from the 50s. Fertilizer consumption, obviously in support of growing crops, but also just shot up. And when we look at tropical forest loss, I'll refer to that in a minute. Of course, here in South Africa, we're not talking about tropical forests, but much of what I'm going to say relates to a global perspective. And of course, we can find various variations on that when we talk about South Africa specifically. And then, of course, terrestrial degradation, the degradation of land and transformation of land, also just gone off the charts in the last 70 to 80 years. So this great acceleration, of course, is not the result of every one of the 7.5 billion people on the planet contributing equally to this. And when we look just at the emissions that arise from consumption practices, we find that, and this is a very simplistic graphic, but those considered to be rich, the 10% of the wealthiest people on the planet, are in fact contributing half of the emissions as a result of individual consumption. And the reverse is true for the 50% least wealthy or poor people on the planet, contributing only 10%. So of course, these bring very complicated nuances to how we look at global challenges, how we look at sustainable development goals, and how we look at nature and the protection and safeguarding of biodiversity, of course. So from the Living Planet reports that WWF is one of the institutions that is part of publishing a report every second year. The Living Planet report of 2020 shows us this figure which depicts the human ecological footprint against the Earth's biocapacity in the green dotted line here. And we find that carbon emissions are responsible for 60% or just over 60% of the human ecological footprint. Now, of course, each of these slivers, each of these envelopes represent a different form of land use that are absolutely essential to sustain us: cropland, grazing lands, oceans, built environment here in the little brown slither. And you can see everything is increasing. Certainly croplands are increasing because of our growing needs for food as human populations are also growing. And clearly here, we've already in the 70s overshot the Earth's biocapacity. And basically what we've done is we've parked the excess carbon that we've emitted in the atmosphere when we've exceeded the Earth's capacity to sequester that carbon in a natural carbon cycling process. And of course, we know what that leads to. We'll talk in some greater depth about climate change in a short while. So I'm drawing far and wide to put the Sustainable Development Goals in some sort of perspective. Many of us will be familiar with Johan Rockstrom and his Resilience Institute group, who already in 2009 published a paper on the planetary boundaries. Now, we can pick, I mean, my instinct as a former academic is to pick holes in, so why are these Earth systems the ones that feature here as the 9 systems that are being looked at? But in essence, what we're looking at is in the center, where you can see green, the outer limits of the green, that center is what is considered to be the safe zone for the Earth to operate in, or for us to operate in relation to each of these systems. And through the course of this presentation, I'll focus on 3 of those that relate very specifically to the work, to the subsequent work that I present. That of climate change, where we have exceeded the safe zone and we're going into the zone of uncertainty. Biodiversity, or the integrity of biological systems, where in some respects we appear to have moved into the red zone already. And the land system change planetary boundary, where we're sitting and fast approaching the danger zone. So of course, these are somewhat imprecise, but there are very clear targets that have been set, or limits, boundaries that have been set for each of these. And it's in relation to these that subsequent depictions of the planetary boundaries have been made. This is a more recent representation showing that for those 3 featured slices that we are moving outside the safe zone. So let me get back to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, of course, if you sit in Norway, and I'll show you shortly why I talk about Norway. If you sit in Norway, your view of the Sustainable Development Goals will be very, very different to somebody sitting in Malawi or in South Africa. And the Sustainable Development Goals obviously have a very strong developmental focus, and focusing significantly on the interests, the well-being, and the development of people. And so you'll see that the first 4 Sustainable Development Goals are around poverty eradication, zero hunger, health, and education. Very important things, but in many developed countries, all of those boxes have been well ticked. Maybe not sustainably always, but certainly from a human perspective, those have been well ticked. And then at the bottom here, just to highlight a few, we find some of the Sustainable Development Goals that I'll focus on a little bit more closely later on, that focus on the issues of our natural foundations. So the ideas always, or the ideas behind the Sustainable Development Goals is always, if we look at the x-axis here, that of human development, with increasing human development moving from left to right, versus the ecological footprint per capita. And of course, what we try and do or strive for as nations, understandably, is we try and push human development into the far right green box. And what we should be doing from a sustainability perspective is to try and push human footprint right down there. So you will, of course, find that there are countries that have very high human development, and that seems to be correlated with very high individual or per capita footprint. No surprises for the countries that sit up here. That, by the way, would be the US. And then many of the African countries sit down here, very generally low on the Human Development Index scale, but also relatively low on ecological footprint. South Africa, of course, would be probably this dot. I can't be 100% sure, but it sits around about here in the sense that we have a higher footprint per capita, but also comparatively higher human development. And so this is the challenge that besets humanity. I sit here as a conservationist, as an environmentalist, but I cannot deny that this is what we all have to strive for, because we have the reality of human needs and the need for humans to develop. So if we look at the Human Development Index as given in the United Nations Human Development Report, and I referred to Norway earlier, is the country with the highest index for human development. And then compared to South Africa. So I'll give two more slides that lay out parameters along this scale. And these are just selected African countries. I gave a lecture recently to a group of students who were from these countries. So I specifically went and fetched the information for each of them. And Malawi, of course, is why I mentioned Malawi. So if we look at the proportion of population that lives below the breadline, so we might want to argue with this, and there's some interpretation here, but this comes from this United Nations report. Of course, in Norway, we don't even register people below the breadline. The breadline is not necessarily people who go to bed hungry, but people who cannot meet all of their very basic needs, accommodation needs, food, education, health, etc. And we find that South Africa, obviously, as I don't understand the difference between these two countries, Namibia and South Africa, near neighbors, but the statistics tell us that many African countries are not looking very good here. Of course, in South Africa, we have 1 in 5 people who go to bed hungry at least once a week. Many of us on this call would never have thought that. 1 in 5 South Africans go to bed hungry once a week. We also have about 15% of South Africans that are obese and therefore not eating the right diets. So obviously very big challenges there around food. And if we look at mortality rates from unsafe water and sanitation, here, of course, Norway again doesn't register. South Africa, lowest of the African countries, but there are countries with pretty significant problems in this space. And again, let's not quibble about why the bar is where it is. These are the raw data from the United Nations Development Report that I made use of. But it is to illustrate the point that despite the Sustainable Development Goals that were embraced in 2015 and signed up to in 2016, the goals for eradicating poverty and zero hunger and so on is for the year 2030. Now, of course, with COVID, this has received a significant setback, and it's unlikely that most of these targets are going to be met by 2030. Probably not solely because of COVID, but largely as a result of COVID. So we, just to put the Sustainable Development Goals together, there's 17 of them. They stack in this way, and many of you will be familiar with a business used to talk about 10 years ago. Mervyn King and others were talking about the triple bottom line, and they showed 3 circles that intersected, but much of the circles lay outside one another. And those of intersection between social, financial, and environmental issues, economic, social, and environmental issues were considered to overlap only there. But the reality is that the Sustainable Development Goal concept has clearly recognized the foundational importance of the biosphere. You can see where I'm heading with this, and societies and our social needs and actions and activities play out as a subset of the broader constraints, and our economies are a subset of our social activities, a very important one at that. And I'll show a little bit later why economic issues are in fact important. If we just look at the foundational environmental SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, then just to mention a few of the facts that come out of this. Basically, each year, roughly 10 million hectares of forests are destroyed. And these are data between 2015 and 2020, when the Sustainable Development Goals were already well underway. Now, to put this in perspective, 10 million hectares is how big? Well, Kruger National Park is 2 million, just under 2 million hectares in size. So let's just park that. And then if we look on the right here, 2 billion hectares of land are already degraded, and that's about a quarter of the total habitable land surface across the globe. So about a quarter of it is considered degraded and affecting almost half, let's say 40% of people who live on this planet. And so we can carry on, we can draw statistics out of this, which come out of the Sustainable Development Goal assessments as we are progressing. Let me just switch gears a little bit, and I tread very carefully going into speaking knowledgeably about the climate space. I know there's some of our attendees who speak far more knowledgeably, and in fact are authors of this report, the 6th report of the IPCC that's just recently been published or made public. And basically the report, says nothing particularly new. It just really hammers home how clear it is, the science is underpinning what we already smelt in the wind 40 years ago, what we could touch 30 years ago. 20 years ago, we could kick it, and 10 years ago, we could almost taste it. And now, it's really, this report is really in our faces. And basically, the very, very clear message is that global warming is set to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 2 decades. Now, 1.5 degrees Celsius is that kind of holy grail that we try to keep global warming below. And it's therefore important that we see that as a line in the sand. And from this report, clearly, there's great urgency. So let me just take us through 500 million years of planetary history. Of course, there's a long history before this. Most of us can only start thinking in one of these vertical lines on the far right in terms of our realities of our research and So basically what we're talking about is the Holocene, is the epoch that started about 10,000 years ago, in which we've had a relatively stable climate, which allowed, of course, the production of crops, the cultivation of land, the settling of the building of cities, and it really, in this period of the last 10,000 years is where we really had our human honeymoon. And if I can then just take this 800,000 years section and look at carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, and we find that it is sort of cycled up and down from 800,000 years ago. between about 300, between 150 and 300 parts per million, until we hit this last little slither, which is the Industrial Revolution. And we are currently sitting, I'm told, around about 415 parts per million, 415. So we've moved very, very rapidly, and that's and this is pretty much the climate predicament that we sit with. So if we then look, and I mean, I could have picked a different and better, longer scaled slide here, but basically what also comes out of the 6th report of the IPCC is that we're already sitting with a high probability of 1.1 degree warming since the Industrial Revolution. So 1.1 degrees already in the bag of the 1.5 degrees that we say we need to keep temperatures under. One of the more worrying things is the melting of the ice caps. So this graph depicts the extent of sea ice in summer in the Arctic. And the models there, the solid black line in the middle shows us what was predicted with some confidence limits of a number of models that predominantly fall within these outer boundaries. And the observed data show that we're actually looking a lot worse than what we were predicting. So in a way, the polar ice caps, the Arctic and the Antarctica, are some of the thermostats, the climate regulators, and it is extremely worrying that we're looking at this. So let's now try and tie just briefly together the relationship between atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations and temperature. And of course, we just need to look at this top one because we're talking about 415 parts per million carbon dioxide at the moment in the atmosphere, and the temperature range that it could lead to is between 1 and just under 3 degrees. So it's pretty much aligned with where we're saying things are going. And then if one just looks at a range of impacts, and this is not deep science, this is just observational data that's been put together. But at 1.1 degrees where we already are, we can already see significant increases in extreme weather events, both in the intensity of those as well as the frequency. It only takes you to make your living out of insurance to fully understand what this is all about. Anybody in the insurance industry is coming to understand very, very clearly what this means. At 1.5 degrees, we're going into further significant impacts. And of course, the coral reefs, the Great Barrier Reef is already suffering significant damage, and 1.5 degrees is what we'd be lucky to get away with. Of course, there are other scenarios that take us into extinctions and ever increasing intensities of storms. And we can see on the news from across the world, drought, famine, floods. I don't know why I did that. Fires, the Australian fires. Yes, the intensity and frequency is just increasing. Of course, in 2006 already, Sir Nicholas Stern, he became Sir, which according to Rassie Erasmus is not such a big thing in South Africa, the Sir thing. But Sir Nicholas Stern is an economist who published The Economics of Climate Change. And he basically pointed out that the costs of mitigation are modest relative to the costs of inaction, of business as usual, and that the costs of mitigation is not inconsistent with growth, with economic growth. And so every year lost in delaying action means that instead of taking medicine, we're going to be having to take an amputation or some serious organ damage. When we think about the carbon budget, so the concept of a carbon budget is essentially been calculated by scientists to tell us how much more carbon we can release into the atmosphere and still get away with a 1.5 degree warming. So remember, 1.5 degrees, of course, is that golden standard. And basically what this tells us is that my next slide will tell you a little bit about what COVID has done, but it certainly dropped our carbon intensity as a global economy by about 6%. But the longer we delay, the longer we wait to start our run, the faster we have to sprint. So if we started early, if, for example, in 2016, we'd started reducing our carbon emissions by 5% year on year, we could have tracked the green curve. Now that we're waiting, and if we started our sprint this year or towards the end of the year, we would have to be running at a much faster rate, and we would have to be a net zero by 2040, and so on. So of course, we are looking at the red curve. That really means that we would have to be looking at about 15% emissions reduction. So the longer we wait, the faster we must cut emissions. This is behind the concept of having a remaining carbon budget. And of course, different nations at different levels of development, very, very complicated problem. You have basically 200 nations, each with a paddle, sitting in a round bucket, trying to paddle their own way, which makes it extremely complicated. And as I said, COVID has resulted in the sort of dead stop we saw this last year in 2020 resulted, or was projected to result in about a 6% drop in greenhouse gas emissions, which would still have been short of the 7.5% reduction required to get to that 1.5. So a lot has to happen for us to make this on time. And of course, what I've told you about relates to the planetary boundary around climate change. And this is where perhaps the penny has best dropped. This is where we will see rapid action. If it's not going to come from nations, it'll come from the business sector, because it's very clear that it'll be much more financially profitable to act earlier than to wait longer. So let me tie in the why we should care about nature, and I'll move quite fast here, but because this is material that will be well known to many on this call. So of course, land use change and climate change are closely interlinked with nature or biodiversity as an intermediation between these. But of course, as we clear more land, as we clear more of the Amazon to grow beef and crops, we decrease the Earth's capacity to absorb carbon that it could have absorbed. So it just adds to the climate change problem. So these are very, very tightly interlinked. And then I specifically just briefly want to focus on the true cost of food. 70% of biodiversity loss on land is caused by food production. And if we look at it more broadly, so the food production statistic sits in the left corner here. It's just a repetition from the previous slide. But the way in which we produce food has massive consequences for biodiversity, for the functioning of ecological systems, and for this whole cocktail of development and sustaining that development. Half of agricultural land is considered degraded. Agriculture accounts for 70%, and that's pretty much a standard across the world. It's pretty much the same statistic in South Africa, and so on. Agriculture is responsible for 8 million of that 10 million hectares of deforestation that we talked about earlier. So of course, these are not things that are completely out of our control, but a lot more needs to be done in order to address these issues. And the planetary boundary of land system change is one of the three that I wanted to focus on today, and I'll just leave it there for the moment. But why should we care about nature? Well, you know, to people like me and most of you, it inspires us. It brings a quality of life. It's something that we treasure and hold in wonder. But nature also works for us. Spot this bee in the middle and the load of pollen that it's carrying, hard at work. And this work translates into real money, because an estimate puts the global worth of pollination by natural pollinators at about $3 trillion a year. Now, 3 trillion, multiply that by 14, and you know, you get a number with a staggering number of zeros in terms of rands. This is just unbelievably important for us. So if we talk about nature services to us, provisioning services such as timber, energy, food production, etc., supporting services that include soil formation, nutrient cycling, regulating services that include climate and carbon storage, carbon sequestration, the natural sequestration of carbon, water flow, and flood attenuation. That's the kind of regulatory services that we get. And with hurricanes very much in the news, of course, we need every little bit of natural help we can get in terms of attenuating the impacts of those floods as a result of these unstable climate events. And of course, they're the cultural services, spiritual, tourism, cultural heritage, values, etc. And ultimately, and I'm not going to stand on this one, but fundamentally, what this slide tells us is just to remind us that nature pretty much underpins human health, human well-being, and you name it, it underpins our economies and food production and everything else. So let's take stock, and I refer to the Living Planet reports that's produced every second year. We've got data from 1970, and the report of 2020 was able to analyze data going up until 2016. So this is the most recent Living Planet index that we have. I won't go deep into explaining how the index is, but it's basically a basket of populations, vertebrate populations that have been studied. This is a fairly robust data set with just under 10,000 population studies that have been done that show that there's been 2/3 decline in the abundance of species just generally that have been well studied. When we look at freshwater systems, it's even worse, far more severely impacted. Now, these are just indices. I'm not trying to make a point about any individual population, but it's showing that despite all of the efforts that many of us in this webinar, all of the nations, the statutory agencies, the NGOs, businesses, private people, communities, despite all of our efforts and all of our investments, we've just seen this slide. And we've seen with the scale of the challenge at the start of this presentation that this simply is something that has to be nipped in the bud. And so we could see these indices as the canary in the coal mine. To me, it looks more like a canary that has already snuffed it. And it is pretty much a crisis. I'm saying this to a group of scientists, but the reality is that with the pressures on our natural systems, we have to do something that is fundamentally different. We cannot continue with business as usual. And so it's the biodiversity systems planetary boundary that is in perhaps worse shape of all of the ones we're discussing today. So to bring it back to economy, and Professor Partha Dasgupta published the study, very similar to what Nicholas Stern did for climate change. Dasgupta did it for biodiversity. And basically, I just extracted two fundamental conclusions that relate to this presentation. First of all, the increased extraction of these services now comes at the expense of future provision of those same services. In other words, they're simply not sustainable. And then from an economics perspective, and this is something that has to be rectified. Nature's worth to society, that is the goods and services it provides, is not reflected in current market prices. So there's an externalization of cost, and that cost is building up even faster than what carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere. And those chickens or those canaries will come to roost. I don't need to spend too much time on this. It's just to show the sheer size of the biodiversity asset value. This is not drawn to scale because you wouldn't see the dots to the right. But the underlying economic value of our natural assets is in the range of 125 to 140 trillion US dollars a year. And if we look at the current investment in biodiversity, in supporting it, it's in fact 3/10,000ths of the actual asset value. Now, if that's the kind of investment return that you expect in your pension fund, then it would equate to you and me putting in just a few cents into our pension fund and getting a big fat return at the end of it. Of course, that is not sustainable. It's just to put it in those terms. And this penny, of course, has dropped in the broader business world. The World Economic Forum of 2021 global risks are ranked by likelihood and by impact. So likelihood, the chance of it occurring, and you find the top 5 are green, are in our sort of nature space, extreme weather, climate action failure, biodiversity loss, etc. And by impact, 5 of the top 10 are considered to have the greatest impact. And just look, infectious diseases, we're sitting in the midst of a pandemic. So climate action failure is trumped in terms of impact only by the immediate impact of COVID. But it's not going away. We can't vaccinate against it. So let me tie this together briefly. And this is, you know, the New Deal is a play on words, I suppose. Franklin Roosevelt, after the Great Depression, put together an economics a turnaround kind of plan, and they called it the New Deal. You know, it sounds very American, sounds like a big deal. But we're talking here about securing a new deal for people. Note, people is very much part of it, and nature. And we again revert to the Sustainable Development Goals, understanding that the foundation of our sustainable development rests on the biosphere, on environmental or ecological parameters. And the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, form the agenda along which the world moves. It's a non-binding agreement. It's not a treaty, but it sets the agenda for the world by 2030. Now, if we look at the Paris meeting in 2015, where significant progress was made in terms of commitments that were being required of individual countries. And these are binding commitments that are going to be evaluated and put on the table. We say that a third of the action on climate must come from nature-based solutions. In other words, ways of not only mitigating climate change, but adapting to the impacts of climate change. So we need to make sure that we do not lose any further natural carbon sequestration potential, that we enhance the natural ability of land to sequester carbon, but also to provide the resilience where climate events play themselves out at increasing intensity and frequency. And then, of course, action on nature is a major contributor, as we saw in that schematic, with nature at the base of the Sustainable Development Goals. But leading up to later this year, September this year in Glasgow, there'll be a conference of parties looking to develop a global biodiversity framework that aligns with the climate treaty, as well as with the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. And in essence, this, I know, and I'm somewhat embarrassed to say, is somewhat unscientific, but it does depict what we imagine has to happen going forward. We simply have to bend those curves that keep going down. We have to bend them back so that we hit net positivity by 2030. And we can rebuild back to recover the capacity of natural systems to support the 9.5 billion people that are going to be around by 2050. This is a massive challenge, a massive juggling act, and it's complicated by different interests from different countries. But if I had to put it in a nutshell, and this is my penultimate slide, if we put this in a nutshell, the New Deal for people and nature has to look at 3 key focus areas. First of all, net zero loss of natural habitats by 2030. What does that mean? It means that we have to get hard at work at restoration of systems that are heavily degraded in order to rejuvenate their capacity to sustain life as we know it. So the net zero basically amounts to the fact that we understand that we cannot immediately flick a switch and stop further habitat loss and degradation, but we need to slow that down and supplement it with restoration of nature so that we break even by 2030. We do not wish to see the extinction of another species by 2030. And the reason why this is important, and you'd expect it from an organization like WWF, but a fundamental reason for why this is important is that every species is in fact a rivet in the wing of an airplane, which secures the integrity of that airplane to fly. And when you start taking those rivets out of the wing, you don't know at what point you've taken one too many that you completely unwind the craft's ability to carry you. And finally, we have to halve our footprint in relation to the production, the way in which we produce goods, and the way in which we consume. And that is something that every one of us can get busy with, but certainly we want to see very, very clear targets that stack up to deliver these outcomes in the New Deal for people and nature. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions. So let me stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Morné. That was a very strong call for a need for a new deal between people and nature. And I think a perfect talk for a multidisciplinary society like the Royal Society. And I'm sure that the audience has been both informed and inspired by what you've had to say. What I found interesting is that if you'd given this talk, say 2 or 3 decades ago, the emphasis would have been on endangered species and the role of game reserves in preserving mainly mammals and birds. But now we're looking at things much more holistically. And I get the impression that you're almost siding with that radical group, Extinction Rebellion, in calling for a complete overhaul of our political and economic systems if we are really to solve this problem.
Mike, yes, I don't know too much about the Extinction Rebellion, other than that they've obviously got a lot of profile and they active. They're not sitting still. But you know, if we talk about a political system, I would not venture into that field necessarily. But what I can say without equivocation is that we do need to address the carbon intensity of our economies. So if that requires a relook at our economies, then you know, that's fundamental. And in South Africa, we have a particular challenge with our economy, which is among the 10 most carbon intensive. So for every unit of growth in GDP, we are among the most carbon intensive, and we have to decarbonize that. There's no question about that. That's a very first and good start. But certainly this goes well beyond the fence of the game reserve within which you and I love spending so much of our time.
Thank you. We have a long statement and question from Guy Mitchley. And Guy, I'd like to invite you to speak directly to us on your question.
Thanks, Mike. Hi there, Morné. Good to see you.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Guy.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a suggestion and look for a potential solution. One of the solutions. We've got this. Human society consumes about 25% of the net primary production on the planet at the moment, but our efficiency of that consumption is going up all the time. So that's a positive trend. Half the world's obese, the other half is undernourished. That's a very interesting and important point. And we waste a large fraction of the food we produce. So can we somehow harness these inefficiencies and increasing efficiencies to slow or even reverse the way that we are trading off nature for calorie production?
Yeah, Guy, look, I mean, it's easy for me to sit here and say, yes, of course, that's what we've got to do. The devil is in the detail of actually making it happen, because you're dealing, you know, with surplus food produced in parts of the world, significant amounts of waste. You're dealing with the wrong things being produced, etc. But maybe if I could take your question just on a slight tangent. I haven't spoken, and I'm not blind as an individual to the fact that when we talk about planetary boundaries, of course, there is such a thing as human innovation, and many of us environmentalists are afraid to go into thinking about this, but of course, there is the potential for technologies and innovation to sharpen the way in which we go about producing our foods. In other words, we could push out the safe zone through technological means, but it is not necessarily the most effective, the most efficient, and most certainly not the most cost-effective way of going about business. So why would you want, as they're currently doing in China, go about pollinating your crops by hand? And I'm told that in China, it's cheaper to pollinate your crop manually by hand than to get the bee guy in to come and bring his beehives in. And, you know, so you've got two artificial forms of pollination. The one is just a bit more natural than the other. So you still have to bring your beehive in for the bees to do their bit, and then you take it away and you go somewhere else with your bees. So you know, we are able to do these things. And if you remember the graph that had biocapacity on it, you know, you see the strange phenomenon that biocapacity of the earth increases over time. Of course, that's the built-in efficiencies, not at the scale that's required, but those efficiencies have been enabled us to lift the Earth's capacity to provide for us. I'm not sure I answered your question fully, but maybe over a beer.
Thank you, Morné. We'll have to move on to the next question from Ntuthuko Mkhizi. Ntuthuko, would you like to address your question, or should I read it out? All right, let me read the question. How do we have halve footprint of production and consumption with an accelerating human population? How do we achieve it?
You know, that's probably one of the easier things to do if you think. So let's just think about the US, and we compare it to let's say Zambia. And I haven't got the statistics, but let's just compare. So the per capita footprint or impacts of humans on the planet in Zambia, if that was set at 1, then the average American would have a footprint between 10 and 30 times as much. So let's just go for 10 times the footprint. So you can immediately see that if you were able to get every American to reduce their footprint by half by taking on more sustainable consumption patterns, that they're far more rapidly able to reduce the impacts on the planet than by talking about the number of people operating at the level of 1. Now, of course, there are many, many complications to this as well, but I just wanted to put it in its simplest form that 350 million people in the US have the footprint of 3.5 billion Chinese people. So there are many, many Chinese, and China is on the way up. So the aspirations are similar to what they are in the US. And of course, you know, everyone is entitled to a better quality of life, but we have to fundamentally address the issue of consumption and how we produce things in order to make sure that we get the lever into the portion of the equation that we can manipulate or move far quicker than the population size one. It's not saying that a head count is not an important parameter in the equation of the dilemma that we sit with, but it's not the one that's easiest dealt with.
So we're dealing with quality of life rather than quantity of life. All right, we have a very interesting question from George Branch. George, would you like to present it?
Thank you, Mike. First of all, thank you, Morné, for a very stimulating and interesting talk. In my experience, there are 3 groups of people that you need to change behavior if you are going to accomplish anything. One group is the general public. The second group are the regional to national politicians who need to implement often unpopular things. And the third group is the international level of politicians and politics. And I think we need rather different approaches if we're going to meet these very different people with their different needs. You know, I've learned a hard lesson that throwing facts at people very seldom accomplishes anything if they hold an opinion, because they simply stick to their own opinion. Somehow you need to get alongside them. And of course, that's easier with local people than it is with politicians. And it's certainly easier with local politicians than it is with international politicians. So I'd like to hear your perspective on how we should meet these people in order to change their mindsets.
George, yeah, very nice to hear your voice, and I saw your face briefly earlier on. Very, very important points you make. You know, I think when we start talking about the average politician at national level, then we're dealing with a mismatch between the time scale at which people are elected to do things compared to the time scale over which this plays itself out. So, you know, we're talking about National politicians will very easily sign up to a target that has to be met by 2030 or ideally 2050, because, you know, I sign up to it now. I do nothing for the next 5 or 10 years that I'm in power. And then I leave something that's even more difficult to solve for people to come after. And it just keeps rolling like that. So that is a very, very fundamental challenge. So I'm just describing perhaps what you identified as an even bigger problem. So that scale mismatch, I think, and it's not my organization style we're not an activist organization, but I have seen, and I heard the mention of Extinction Rebellion. We know these young activists from the North who have become very, very prominent. That is the future. And I think we are going to see, as time goes on, more and more instability as a result of that activation. It's not going to happen through normal means. I think as Jürgen Randers, one of the authors of that Club of Rome kind of projections for, you know, that were published in 1970, he says that humans have evolved to live with information upon which they don't act, and then to use their ingenuity to weasel out of the problem later on because they can. And in his most cynical state, he thinks that ultimately that is probably what's going to happen. But George, yeah, I don't know. I think it's easier for people who make a career in international policy and politics to go wafting around making these long-term commitments, and they have no real traction on the ground. They're not as sensitive to the timescales. The locally elected politicians are the ones that we have a real problem with. So you have to be a visionary leader, a statesman, to lead your nation into voluntary carbon reductions. You know, there is this cartoon that I think most of us have seen, where you know, where somebody says, so what if we do all of these good things? We change, we become, our air is cleaner, we reduce our carbon emissions. And what if it wasn't necessary and we end up with a planet with clean water and clean air? You know, it's ironic that we have to ask these kind of rhetorical questions, because yeah, we simply lived as if there was no tomorrow as we accumulated bigger head count and more needs as humanity. And now we suddenly sitting with the dawning realization that there is a tomorrow, but only if we do something about it. I'm probably just preaching to the generalist crowd at the moment, George, but do you have any suggestions?
Thank you, Morné. Yes, I agree with everything you said. From my own experience, my greatest successes in convincing either individuals or politicians has arisen from two things. One is getting alongside people so that you understand where they are coming from. You know, our disparate society in South Africa is such that it's incredibly different in how I might approach a poor, impoverished, deprived person versus a person who is relatively well off. The second lesson that I've learned is that I accomplish almost nothing if I simply preach facts that head-butt with people. My greatest successes have been getting to understand other people's perspectives and getting them to understand my perspectives so that they can make up their own minds. But thank you for a very stimulating talk, and the questions themselves, I think, have indicated the nature of how stimulating it is. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
George. Move on to a very challenging question from Judy Mann. Judy, go ahead.
My question, thanks very much, Morné. A really interesting talk and very, very thought-provoking. My question always comes back to normal people. So if you had to think of one thing that each of us should actively be doing right now, what would that one thing be that we all really can do? Yeah, thank you very much.
So Judy, before I turn it back to you to answer, I would say arm yourself with knowledge so that you know how to act. In other words, there isn't just one thing, it is about multiple things. So, you know, everything you do in your daily life, and of course, when you say, you know, what do we tell people is the most important thing they do, depends whether they have influence or whether we're just talking about the average citizen going about their lives. And there, I would say, you know, arm yourself with knowledge. So understand what your environmental footprint is, what counts most towards it, and then address that. So when I have friends who sometimes proudly show me, or we sit at dinner and then there's the teenage or the young son or daughter who they then say, oh, we have to, you know, our son has gone on a vegetarian diet, and you know, we're so proud of him for making a stand. I would say that certainly at that type of age, I would never have had the sensitivity and the, you know, the ability to deprive myself of what I thought was just the normal way of eating. But what one has to ask then is, if you go to the teenager's cupboard, how many Mr. Price t-shirts are hanging in the cupboard? Is there one for every day of the week, or is there, you know, is it a cupboard that's absolutely packed? And I'm just talking about a certain kind of socioeconomic group that has choices. I think the big thing is about consistency. So where you start choking down on one thing, don't fool yourself that that's enough. You've got to look at everything, understand your footprint, and address it. But I'm sure you also have a far better answer because you think about this all the time, Judy.
That's why you should never ask questions, because they might come back to you. Yeah, thanks, Morné. I think that's a really useful answer, and I think that something for all of us as scientists is to start talking with one voice, so that we're communicating consistently across our channels. And I think that perhaps some of our mixed messages have been part of the reason that we're sitting in the crisis we're in. So I think that that's perhaps something that we can work on, and presentations like this really do help. So thanks very much, and thank you to the Royal Society.
Are you on mute, Mike?
Thank you, Judy. I'm under pressure from Bert to end this discussion, but I really feel that we need to give Chanel Champartab an opportunity to ask her question. She's been waiting very patiently. But Chanel, could I ask you to keep your question short? But please go ahead. Okay, it appears that Chanel is not with us anymore. I'd like to end with one question to you, Morné. I'm speaking as nothing more than a retired fisherman, and I can hardly question the judgment of someone like Klaus Schwab, who said this is a fourth industrial revolution. I don't think it is. I think it's a first post-industrial revolution that's equipped humankind to do things and make decisions that we've never been able to make before because of the tool set that we have available to us and the hyperconnectivity that we've created. My question to you is, what role do you think that modern technology can play in helping us to resolve the environmental crisis? And I'm thinking of things like artificial intelligence and robotics, the Internet of Things, biotechnology, nanotechnology, etc. How important a role will it play?
Mike, good question. And I think certainly, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, is that technological innovation, including artificial intelligence, big data, and understanding, developing deeper understanding, will put us in a better position to push the planetary boundaries somewhat outwards for some of the systems. I think that's entirely within the realm of possibility. And so we're almost certainly going to need that. That's not first base. That's not where we start, because there are far more cost-effective ways and far more integrative ways. You know, I would shudder to be seen to be promoting technological engineering solutions to matters that would ride roughshod over the functioning of normal ecological systems. I don't think technology will provide the cost-effective solutions that nature provides for us now. And pollination, just that's the bee in my bonnet, is just one example.
Right, thank you, Morné. I need to stop the discussion now. It's been absolutely fascinating and entirely relevant to our current existence. I'd like to thank you for the talk, but also thank you and the WWF for all the very valuable work you're doing in coordinating and promoting a greater awareness of what we need to do as inhabitants of the planet Earth, remembering that there are many other, over 9 million other species inhabiting the planet that we share. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who was able to join this discussion. Bye-bye.
Thank you.